Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from different parts of the world. Welcome to the latest edition of the Gas Talk series organized by Big Ship's Global Gas Working Group. Today, we are taking on a narrative that has shaped energy policy, investment decisions, and public finance for decades. And you all are aware that that narrative is natural gas is clean and the gas is a transition fuel. But what if this narrative has never really about the climate? What if the idea of clean gas was not simply the result of scientific misunderstanding, but was actively developed and promoted to protect and expand the fossil gas industry? And importantly, for our work today, what happens when that narrative moves from corporate advertising into the policies and financing decisions of governments and multilateral development banks. That is exactly what we are going to explore today. We are particularly pleased to hold this conversation at a strategically important movement just ahead of the Global LNG Convening and only a few weeks before Gastech 2026, and this all leads to the World Bank Group annuals in October. And this is therefore not just a conversation about history, it is about what this history means for the decision being made today, particularly decisions about public finance, MDB investments, LNG infrastructure, gas fired power plants, pipelines, and the future of energy systems. So, the central message of today's discussion is very clear. Gas is neither a clean fuel nor a transition fuel. The question is, how did we get to a point where this myth became so deeply embedded in public policy and finance? And how do we challenge it effectively? This is equally an important question, and definitely we are going to discuss it today. We have an excellent panel to help us unpack this. We are joined by Rebecca Leber and Rebecca John from the Center for Climate Integrity. They are co-authors of their recently launched report, The Fraud of Clean Natural Gas. Their investigation provides important historical evidence showing that the fossil gas industry had knowledge of the climate risks associated with methane and natural gas decades ago, while simultaneously developing narratives that presented gas as a cleaner and safer energy source. So, Rebecca Leber and Rebecca John, thank you for joining us. We are also joined by Laurie Alize from the Bretton Woods Project. Alize brings an important perspective on multilateral development banks, public finance, and the continued role of gas in international development financing. So, thank you, Alize, for being with us. We also have Devon Wong from Solution for Our Climate, SFOC, who will help us understand emerging trends around the global gas and LNG industry, particularly as we approach Gastech 2026. So thank you very much, Devon, for joining us. And finally, we have Mima Holt from the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, bringing an important perspective on fossil gas, climate policy, and the broader implications of continued investment in gas, particularly LNG, as we approach the global LNG convening next week. So thank you very much, Mima. We will organize today's conversation around three broad questions. First, where did the clean gas narrative come from? Second, how has that narrative translated into public finance and MDB investment? And third, how do we challenge this narrative and build stronger advocacy as we head into major industry and financial institution spaces? We will have a moderated discussion with our speakers, followed by an opportunity for questions from participants. So, dear participants, get ready. We have intentionally keep this webinar in the meeting mode so that you can participate, you can intervene. Feel free to share your questions, your comments, your interventions in the chat. And when our all the speakers will give their interventions, we will open the floor, take your questions and interventions. So let's begin where the story begins. Rebecca Leber and Rebecca John, let me start with you. Your intervention, The Fraud of Clean Natural Gas, takes us back several decades and provides evidence about what the industry knew about methane and climate change. Can you take us back to the origins of the clean natural gas narrative? And when did this narrative begin to emerge? And what did the industry actually know about the climate risks associated with gas at the time? So over to you.
Thank you, Fiza. Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and thanks everyone for joining. So where to start? Yeah, like a lot of people, you probably know about the oil and gas industry's carbon dioxide deception, how Exxon and other companies knew in the 60s and 70s that carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels would cause climate change, but spent decades misleading the public through climate denial and delay. There have been lots of brilliant investigations that have brought this history to light over the last 10 years or so, but what hasn't been known about until now is how the industry responded to its methane problem and how it has been able to argue for decades that expanding gas production could be a climate solution, despite methane being a climate superpollutant, 80 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide over the short term. Our investigation for the Center for Climate Integrity, it's a US nonprofit that's part think tank, part advocacy group, set out to discover exactly this. And what we uncovered was a separate deception, the industry's methane deception. And our report, The Fraud of Clean Natural Gas, which we published in July, so just last month, tells this story for the very first time. Since we published, several major outlets, including the New York Times, like you can see in this slide, have featured our findings. And so the report itself is the result of an extensive multi-year investigation, drawing on hundreds of documents, many of which have never been seen before, but all of which we've now made public through the report. And we obtained them from archives, libraries, and in some cases from the individuals involved in the actual events. So for the most part, this is really a history that is told through the industry's own words. And big picture, we found that the oil and gas industry understood the climate risks of methane by the late 70s, early 1980s, and also knew that their own operations were contributing to the buildup of methane in the atmosphere. But despite this knowledge, the industry deliberately promoted gas as clean and a climate solution, relying on misleading advertising and their own industry-funded studies to push these narratives and to argue that the levels of methane emitted by their operations did not present a significant threat to the Earth's climate. So what we found is that from the early 70s, the industry has marketed gas as clean, despite knowing about the human health harms of burning and producing gas. We discovered also that the industry has known about its methane emissions and the climate harms of these emissions for a lot longer than has previously been recognized. For example, an internal document from the oil company Shell, quoted here in the slide, shows that as early as 1966, the industry knew that methane from its operations was being, this is the quote, liberated in embarrassingly large quantity from oil fields all over the world. Then we also discovered that in 1968, the industry was told that methane from its operations had been detected in the Earth's atmosphere. And then between 1976 and 1985, major studies from NASA and other scientific institutions firmly established the climate risks of methane from oil and gas industry operations, and that it was likely to cause future warming. And we saw that industry was also tracking these developments. So in other words, they knew. But when public awareness of climate change became widespread towards the end of the 1980s, when the world was looking for alternatives to burning coal and oil, the US oil and gas industry, which by this time included the big producers, so Mobil, Shell, BP, Chevron, etc., as well as the gas utilities and pipeline companies, they decided to market gas or methane with its outsized heat-trapping powers as a climate solution and transition fuel. So instead of responding to the science in good faith, what we discovered in the documents is that the industry actually doubled down, sponsoring its own program of strategic research upon which it would base its future communications with the public, scaling up the myth of clean gas to argue that gas was also a climate solution. In 1990, the gas industry cited its own research in some of its own communications, targeted to an audience that it was keen to partner with, and it declared misleadingly, methane is not a major greenhouse gas. But generally speaking, although there were some outright examples of this denialism, the industry's preferred approach was generally to shift public focus away from methane and towards carbon dioxide. Burning gas, which does emit smaller amounts of carbon dioxide than coal and oil, was a better option, according to the industry, glossing over its own methane problem. So by 1990, despite publicly stating that its emissions were low, documents show that in fact the US oil and gas industry did not know the true extent of its methane emissions. So publicly claiming that gas could be a climate solution and transition fuel, in private it didn't really have any idea at all in detail of how big a methane emissions problem it had. One industry study we found from 1979 showed that emissions might actually be 2 to 4 times higher than those being officially reported. And by the late 1980s, independent studies had found that relatively high levels of methane were being emitted, significant enough to present a serious climate risk and offset any potential benefit of switching from coal and oil to gas. So towards the end of the 80s, as concerns about methane emissions became more widespread, in line with general concerns about climate change, the industry knew it needed a statistically defensible number that it could point to argue that gas was actually better for the climate than coal or oil. And in 1990, the industry partnered with the US Environmental Protection Agency in what was meant to be the gold standard official investigation into this question of methane emissions. And we discovered, however, that the industry funded this study through a $4.5 million research fund, and that oil and gas industry players from lobby groups such as the American Gas Association and the American Petroleum Institute, as well as companies like Chevron, Shell, and Texaco, exerted control over the study from beginning to end, overseeing its development of its goals and methodology, providing most of the data sets, reviewing its progress 6 times across the project's lifespan, and then, thanks to documents we requested through the US Freedom of Information Act, we also discovered that the standard final EPA in-house technical review was secretly replaced with a technical review conducted by industry representatives from Shell, Texaco, Consolidated Edison, and the American Gas Association. So effectively, the documents show the industry marking its own homework 3 times over. And when this study was published, in 1996, it purported to find very low levels of methane emissions from gas operations. According to the study, only 1.4% of the total amount of gas going through the system was being released into the atmosphere. And this figure supported the gas industry's position that switching from coal and oil to gas was better for the climate. The industry then used the study to go all out promoting gas as a climate solution, arguing that expanding gas usage could reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Methane, no drawback, stated one typical industry publication, which I think we have a picture of on the next slide. There you go, there it is, in black and white, a very bold assertion. And so this highly compromised study has also been the cornerstone for estimating methane emissions in the US and around the world It also, as well as influencing the guidelines in the US, it was hugely influential in influencing IPCC guidelines, which has meant decades of undetected and undercounted methane emissions. In addition to this, the oil and gas industry used their low emissions myth to lobby governments worldwide that voluntary programs would be sufficient for managing methane emissions. Since gas was clean, they argued there was no need for the stringent kind of penalties and legal enforcement that a legally binding regulatory system would entail. So all of this has allowed the oil and gas industry to evade adequate regulation of methane emissions to this day. Essentially, that's how we got to where we are now. And looking back, today's gas-dependent world was never inevitable. As the president of the American Gas Association said in 1988, a new era of natural gas would not be fulfilled automatically. Instead, what we see is the industry working hard to create it over decades, basing its campaigns on a falsehood that gas was clean. How the industry did this is really important, and the 1996 emission study was only one element of a decades-long strategic campaign. There are many parallels with today in their wider campaign, and I'll hand over now to my co-author, Rebecca Lieber, to describe in more detail how the industry deliberately constructed the clean gas myth to achieve its goals of establishing gas as a primary energy source.
Thank you. So I will be covering much of the same period that Rebecca just described from about the 1960s onward. But my focus will be more on the strategic communication side of how the oil and gas industry constructed and then expanded on this idea that gas is clean and sold it aggressively to partners and third parties, which included environmental groups. The gas industry conducted a series of internal surveys from the late 1960s and the early 1970s that recognized that the industry had a problem, an image problem. The public saw that gas was polluting in a period of rising concern about the environment, and the industry was worried it would affect sales. So the industry, namely the American Gas Association, turned to the myth makers of corporate America to change that opinion. PR and advertising companies that worked with the same companies that led the tobacco deception campaigns promoting smoking came up with some of the slogans you see on the following slides. So this campaign, the Clean Energy for Today and Tomorrow, dominated advertising in the 1970s. This was an ambitious marketing effort across print and television where the industry spent many millions of dollars in an aggressive attempt to craft this clean image. And their polling showed that it was working on the people exposed to it. This advertising continued well after scientific studies contradicted this messaging. Studies that came out showing both the climate pollution and indoor air quality concerns caused by natural gas. Over the years, this clean image gave the industry a huge advantage, able to leverage it and expand this myth of clean gas to become one and the same as the myth of gas as a climate solution. Another sample of this messaging and what it became includes gas, the environmental protection energy that came up in the 1980s. This slide shows a full-page ad that appeared in newspapers showing that slogan. Pretty much from the beginning of these clean energy campaigns, the industry was aware that it lacked evidence supporting its claims. This was an era where studies about indoor air pollution from gas were coming out, and also in this context, the advertising firm J. Walter Thompson identified problems with clean gas messaging, and that included that the campaign, you can read quotes on the slide, has been mitigated to an extent by the lack of clear, simple, substantiating facts on the pollution aspects of natural gas. But like it did with tobacco, the firm Hill and Knowlton advised the gas industry to sponsor its own research to create the useful answers to the pollution question. They did this through their own gas research institute, which ended up producing studies casting doubt on indoor air pollution from gas stoves. And later, that scope included looking at methane emissions and gas as a bridge fuel. They effectively created their desired useful answer to supplement this messaging. By the 1980s, the clean gas campaign had evolved to something else relevant to the increasing attention that was being given to climate change. That messaging was that gas is a bridge fuel to renewables, and there were both strategic communications and strategic research arms of this campaign. On the research side, the gas industry sponsored a study that was funded by 28 companies and included an author that was a former Reagan energy official that introduced the idea to the public and policy space that gas was a bridge fuel or bridging fuel, as they called it. And all at the same time, in the late 80s, this idea was also introduced in the popular press. So here on the slide, you see on the left that bridging fuel quote from this report in a letter from American Gas Association's president at the time, and the Washington Post headline at the bottom in 1988, where an AGA official introduces the idea of bridge fuel as a climate solution for the first time in popular press. Central to this clean gas narrative was cultivating allies and third parties to make the case for them that gas was a bridge fuel. The industry recognized that that environmentalists had greater credibility in the space and went out of their way to message to them. And here, they maximized their messaging depending on the audience. This included green groups, the financial community, journalists, consumers, politicians, education materials, PBS, and Olympic sponsorship. So it was truly widespread. But also that messaging changed depending on the audience. Where in some circles, the American Gas Association and other entities promoted gas as a temporary bridge, and others, they clearly admitted this was a destination fuel around for decades longer. And here on the slide shows a quote from one of the PR officials that advised the American Gas Association, urging them that credibility was best won through third-party endorsement. And in our part three, which will be concluding our presentation, we'll talk about why this answer, this clean gas campaign became so influential and its lasting legacy. Part of the answer lies in the success of the industry's deceptive marketing of gas as a bridge fuel. This turned out to be a brilliantly useful concept that had a lot of adaptations. And it was also truly successful in climate terms. Gas has not, the industry was aware that it did not intend gas to be a bridge to a renewable or green future. And like I said, they changed their messaging as was necessary for the audience. So we're going to talk about the legacy here, where in many ways the results speak for themselves, that gas has become dominant, creating the myth making that it is clean and a climate solution, but they've been supported by data that is flawed, controlled by a small set of industry data and blocking policies that would have required more transparent reporting. And before I turn back over to Rebecca John to finish up our presentation, I will just present this quote from Enron gas executive Kenneth Lay, a quote in 1992 where he predicted the legacy of one of the arms of this campaign. So this quote shows how the industry was confident that the gas emissions study Rebecca John talked about earlier would ease concerns some have expressed with respect to methane emissions from the natural gas system. And it turns out he was correct. And it did lay rest to many concerns for years until external monitoring and new science published after the 2010s began to show how wrong this was. So the compelling nature of the communications designed to be influential, well-tested by the industry, positioned gas as something different entirely from what it was and different from oil and coal while underrepresenting the risks of natural gas. And here I'll turn over to Rebecca to wrap up.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. That's yeah. One answer to why these narratives became so influential lies in the sheer force and strategic application of the industry's efforts to promote them. With the results of the all-important 1996 emission study in hand, the American Gas Association and other industry groups too, but the American Gas Association pursued what it described as a total advocacy agenda, ensuring its messages reach the right audiences via the right communication tools. And we see that they used every avenue available. That would be, at the local, state, national, international. They used personal lobbying, emails, the internet in its early days, issue briefs, industry magazines, advertising and PR campaigns that we've just heard about, op-ed pieces in influential newspapers, letters to the editor. They held conferences, pursued educational outreach, promotional sponsorships, deepened their partnerships with environmental groups, and so on. You get the picture. It was an absolute total advocacy agenda in every sense. And then towards the end of the 90s, the oil and gas industry's messages also included lobbying against renewables as unreliable and economically disastrous, which was in direct opposition to its previous and actually ongoing positioning of gas as a bridge and a partner to renewables. But in reality, documents show that the industry embarked on a program of actively lobbying against the renewable energy destination to which gas's bridge was supposed to lead from the mid-1990s. And as we are all too well aware, gas has not been a bridge to a renewable or green future, but in fact has been a highway to climate disaster. So having conquered the US, the industry then took the message worldwide, demanding that any international efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions should promote the direct use of natural gas. And in 1997, US gas companies formed an international gas center, boosting efforts to go global and announcing that their goal was to literally cover the world, which has been, I think, completely successful from their perspectives. Alongside that campaign, the historical record also shows, and this is another part of the question to the answer of why these narratives have been so successful, that many parties keen to find an easy solution to the climate crisis have too easily taken the industry at face value and failed to exercise proper scrutiny over the industry's promises and operations, relying instead on the industry's own data with devastating consequences. All the way as far back as 1975, the gas industry voiced its mission to provide the essentially unending ability to supply gaseous fuels to the public. And this mission did not change in the face of scientific discoveries revealing that methane from oil and gas operations presented a serious climate risk. Instead, the oil and gas industry has stayed focused on expanding gas, and as a result, we have the gas-dependent world we inhabit today, with the industry still lobbying for more and still promising a low climate risk. Industry's claims that gas should be the preferred clean fuel to meet increasing demands for power have frequently become conventional wisdom. Since 2000, the industry has experienced unprecedented growth. Due to the kind of promises that you see here in the slide, that growth has just gone on and on, up and up. And since 2000, the industry has experienced, huge levels of growth. And as a result, atmospheric methane levels are nearly 3 times higher than pre-industrial levels. And as our report shows, increased climate pollution from gas operations has been allowed to fuel the accelerating climate crisis. So that's it, really. I just want to say from both of us, thank you so much for being here today, and we look forward to answering any questions you might have later on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Thank you to both Rebecca's. And I must say that how deliberate was the construction of the clean gas narrative. Oh my God. So thank you very much for these all eye-opening research thing. And I must say that this discussion is now brings us to the second part of our conversation, because the problem is not only that the gas industry has promoted a misleading narrative. The more serious question for us is what happens when public institutions begin financing infrastructure based on that narrative. A gas-fired power plant can operate for decades. An LNG terminal can create long-term contractual commitments. A pipeline can look countries, uh, I must say that a pipeline can lock countries into a particular energy pathway. And once public money is invested, these projects can become politically and financially difficult to reverse. So, let's look at the role of public finance. Alize, let me come to you. The transition fuel argument has been particularly influential in the development finance system. We have also seen MDBs make commitments around the Paris Agreement, Paris alignment, climate finance, and fossil fuel restrictions. Yet, we continue to see debates around gas infrastructure and what qualifies as an exception. So, where do you see the biggest contradictions between MDB climate commitments and their approach to fossil gas?
Thank you so much, Fiza. Just going to share my screen.
Yeah.
Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, it's
Perfect.
going to be started.
Amazing.
It's taking a little time. Yeah, now it's
Oh,
that's
perfect.
yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. And also thank you for this incredible research. It's completely horrible to hear about the background between the fossil fuel industry and how they're putting gas forward as a clean gas and a transition fuel. Really incredible research, but just so horrifying. So yeah, as Fiza mentioned, I guess I'm going to be presenting on a bit of a different tangent, but a bit more about the, I guess, wider kind of economic policies that are shaping our financial architecture, which is also, I guess, causing countries to be so dependent on extracting fossil fuels and gas also. So I work for the Bretton Woods Project, which is a UK-based watchdog of the World Bank and the IMF. So through my presentation, I'm hoping to bring in some of the broader roles that these two institutions, but looking at the World Bank in particular, have played and are continuing to play in shaping countries' dependence on fossil gas extraction, and also constraining countries' ability to implement and plan for a green energy transition, and also being able to invest in renewable energy. Oh, sorry. Nice. I guess to first give some context, we're currently in a historical debt crisis, which is severely squeezing the fiscal space that countries are having to invest in health, education, and also climate action. Most external debt in the global south is denominated in US dollars or other hard currencies, which means that countries need to generate foreign exchange in order to service debt and also pay for essential imports. This is creating strong pressure to expand export sectors that are able to bring in foreign currency and fossil fuels are particularly attractive in that vein. So, for example, as I put on a quote on the slide, we see this, for instance, in Argentina, where the World Bank has been promoting the exploitation of vaca muerta and framing this as key to improve and restore its depleted foreign exchange reserves. But the same is true for many other major oil and gas producers in the global south, including Nigeria, for instance. And this isn't only a supply side story because there's obviously also external demand for this gas, as shown on the quote, as shown on the slide in the quote. While more than 600 million people in Africa still lack access to electricity, they export more than 60% of the gas to rich countries in order to service debt to foreign banks. And this kind of brings me to the other side of the same coin, I guess, which is that this debt crisis is not simply an external shock that countries are responding to, but it is very much a consequence of, in large part, the policies that the World Bank and IMF have been promoting and for decades and shaping the whole economies in the global south. So we see this, for instance, with the structural adjustment programs in the 80s, which promoted the liberalization and privatization of economies, which has weakened domestic productive capacity and domestic demand, and reinforced a model in which countries in the global south specialize in exporting raw materials, while higher value production and supply chains are concentrated elsewhere. And the World Bank and the IMF still play a key role in keeping countries in this loop of austerity and debt. We can see this, for instance, in their debt sustainability assessments, which are key measures to inform whether a country is able to get its debt restructured. And that is based on whether a country's debt is considered sustainable. But there's no clear definition for what sustainable debt means. And it's ultimately a subjective judgment about how much fiscal consolidation a country can undertake in order to find the money to repay this debt, for instance, for example. So all of this is resulting in a particularly difficult trap for countries trying to pursue a different development model focused on green and industrial policy or building out renewable energy that is in service of people. While these debt pressures create the incentives to extract gas, this can also be connected to the World Bank's wider energy privatization agenda, which is basically rethinking how energy systems should be organized, which is where most of my work is focused on. So since the 90s, as part of these structural adjustment program, the World Bank and the IMF have been promoting the privatization and unbundling of energy systems in the global south. And this has also been happening in the global north, but that's another story. So this ultimately means breaking up public utilities and opening up different parts of the electricity sector to private companies and having independent power producers play a major role in building and operating power plants. And that model still very much continues today. In particular, the World Bank has this particular lending instrument called Development Policy Finance, which is basically money it gives to governments, but only if governments implement these specific policy reforms before receiving the money, which they call prior actions. And in our analysis of specifically energy-related prior actions between 2018 to 2023, we found that the World Bank is promoting the exact same textbook model that it has been since the 80s, so privatizing energy systems. And we're also seeing DPFs, so this development policy finance, play an increasingly important role over the years in the World Bank's energy financing specifically. So in 2024, for instance, DPFs accounted for around 68% of the bank's public energy commitments. So yeah, and I guess governments and other kind of public actors are not simply being asked to kind of step away to give way for these private actors, but they're also being asked to actively participate and de-risk and use their public money in order to de-risk private investors coming in. And this is important because investing in energy infrastructure in the global south wouldn't otherwise be profitable and is much riskier and more expensive given the very high cost of capital. So they're kind of enabling this model to continue. And in any case, from our research, what we found and the research of other many civil society organizations, academics and trade unions, is that despite the growing use of public money going effectively to de-risk private profits, this model still has failed to deliver reliable and affordable energy, and is also not delivering on this green transition that it promises. So what does this mean for gas? So the World Bank, so gas is increasingly justified as absolutely necessary for energy access. It's framed as a least cost option as a transition fuel. And the World Bank plays a huge normative role in pushing forward this narrative, including through climate justice arguments by saying that global south countries should not be expected to decarbonize at the same pace as rich countries that have historically produced the bulk of emissions. And they use the UNFCCC's CBDR argument, basically. But this cannot justify reproducing the same fossil fuel model and financial model that has produced energy insecurity, underdevelopment, and dependence on fossil fuels in the first place. So the model that I was talking about in the previous slide, the bank has played an active role in also promoting this model in gas projects. We see this, for instance, in Ghana's Sankofa project, which the Big Shift gas campaign has already highlighted and produced research on. So yeah, I very much encourage you all to read it. But effectively, in 2015, Ghana signed an agreement with private producers to develop this offshore Sankofa oil and gas project, gas field, sorry. And the project was backed by extensive guarantees by the World Bank to attract private investment, which included 20-year take-or-pay contracts, which required the government to purchase a minimum amount of gas, whether it was needed or not. And given that there was some problems in infrastructure and demand, the demand was not as expected, which left Ghana paying around $250 million for unused gas, Sankofa gas, in 2019. So this example shows how governments can be locked into these costly long-term obligations with private producers, even when cheaper alternatives might become available and might exist, while also reducing the state's ability to really have any capacity to do anything about it. And we also see this, for instance, with the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism that allows foreign investors to sue host governments for alleged breaches of investment treaties.
Yeah.
And I think this decentralized renewable energy model is so difficult for the World Bank to promote because it kind of shows the limits of their model because community-owned solar and mini grids and decentralized systems can deliver energy without creating these same large centralized revenue generating assets for fossil fuel producers and require a completely different role for public finance, which is based on grants and public ownership and long-term investment. So sorry, also conscious of time, but this is my last slide. So the World Bank does have climate commitments in place, including its mandate, which is to alleviate poverty on a livable planet. And it has a wider climate change action plan, which was just recently extended, which means it has climate commitments across its lending and operations, which includes being fully Paris aligned. So all its operations are fully aligned with the Paris Agreement. But this is based on its own methodology and the wider MDB's methodology, joint methodology for what this means, which effectively means that projects can still be financed even if they generate significant greenhouse gas emission, but as long as they are aligned with the country's decarbonization pathway. Since Paris alignment, we have seen the overall number of fossil fuel projects approved to be lower than before. But as just discussed, the approach that the bank is using is still very much loose enough that gas can certainly be assessed as aligned. And we may actually see more of these projects as the US is putting pressure on the World Bank to fund fossil fuels. So just to end off, I think there's also a bigger question with the bank's climate commitments and this Paris alignment approach, which doesn't fundamentally address whether the policy reforms itself promotes fit for purpose in the sense of whether they're actually aligned with giving countries the space, the fiscal space, the policy space they need to actually align with the Paris Agreement. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alize. Thanks a lot for sharing your insights along with the case studies and the examples on the perspective that what happens when public institutions begin financing infrastructure based on that narrative and these all impacts, including like traps of debt and privatization and faulty policy lending models impacting global south. So thank you very much for all these important insights. Coming to Mima Holt. Mima, from your perspective, what is the biggest misconception policymakers still have about fossil gas? Is it the assumption that gas is relatively low carbon? Is it the belief that gas is necessary for energy security? Or is it the idea that countries can build gas infrastructure today and transition away from it later? So, which of these arguments do you think we most urgently need to challenge, especially your expertise on LNG? So we really want to hear from you.
Great. Thanks so much, Faiza, and thanks for having me. It's a really big question. I'm going to try to break it down into what I call as sort of like the 5 trends that I'm seeing in the LNG space currently. Because there's no one answer to the question of why isn't there enough political momentum around stopping gas and transitioning to a just renewable energy revolution. And one of the key things that I think I should start with, like the most hopeful thing that I should start with, is that in the entire modern history of the world, where we've had energy crises related to fossil fuel bottlenecks, whether it's because of geopolitical chaos that we're seeing now, and we've seen in the last 5 years, caused by war and tensions between countries, this is actually the first time in our modern history where we have an alternative that is cheaper and that is deployable in basically zero amount of time. We did not have this during the oil crisis of the 70s. And the crises that came out of that as well. This is the first time in history that we actually have a viable, cheap, fast alternative for any energy crises. And that is why we're actually seeing a lot of countries where the fossil fuel industry has been trying to manufacture demand, especially developing countries in Asia, where they are really rethinking their dependence on fossil gas. Now, that's not to say that it's all a bed of roses. Both Rebecca's and Alize put a really good picture of why there is such a strong foundation already for staying with gas and pushing gas. And a lot of it is because of infrastructure, it's because of laziness, it's because of smaller countries being tied to other obligations that include fossil fuels, whether it's gas or oil. But we are seeing the tide turn. So let me just run down through a couple of trends that we're seeing that is a big opportunity for our work. One is that we are seeing now that there is going to be an oversupply of LNG. 2025 was the biggest year for final investment decisions. And that is a bad stat to talk about, right? It's a very discouraging stat to say that there are so many FIDs, meaning that there's so many LNG terminals coming online. The other side to that is a majority of these FIDs have been export terminals, meaning places where you are supplying the gas and not receiving the gas. So there is no comparison to where is the supply going, because we don't have the equivalent number of import terminals coming online as export terminals. And that is a huge opportunity, because you are seeing this sort of mindset shift with many of these countries that fossil fuel industry has said that is going to need the gas, is going to be importing the gas. They are not approving, or the financing for import terminals is not coming as fast as in comparison to supply terminals. So what that means for the LNG industry in general is that they're scared of this glut, because it will have a very big chilling effect on the financing appetite for projects that are uncontracted. So it will lower a lot of the prices for buyers long term. A lot of the appetite for FIDs for supply terminals, for export terminals, is because of this projection of prices that this geopolitical tension is going to keep prices very high for a very long time. But when you get to a point where you realize we don't know where the supply is going, there's going to be an oversupply, then the prices will start to come down. You are not going to be able to put up import terminals as fast as how many export terminals have reached FID. And we are seeing that LNG demand is changing for the better for us. Europe's demand for LNG is structurally waning because the region is now embracing electrification, and which is why we're hearing a lot of narrative around South Asia and Southeast Asia as a new frontier for LNG import capacity. So this is why we're seeing this this narrative around manufactured demand for Southeast Asia specifically. But Southeast Asia was hit really hard by the second trend, Strait of Hormuz crisis, and how energy security has really impacted a lot of these countries. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and I don't know, as of today, I think it's still closed. I don't know really what's going on there, but this blocked 1/5 of the world's LNG supplies. not even to mention the chaos that's happening with the Qatari supplies as well. And Qatar supplies a good chunk of LNG to the Asian part of the world. This has really caused a temporary like supply shock for many countries. Now, the one bad thing about this is that it's delayed the anticipated oversupply. But it has caused a huge energy affordability crisis in a lot of countries, not just countries in Southeast Asia, but also to European allies as well. So we really have this opportunity to push renewables, because if you're seeing, especially in the earlier parts of the summer, where we have seen so many news reports about countries like the Philippines importing high rates of renewable energy, solar panels, to respond to the energy affordability crisis. Again, this is the first time ever in the history of in modern human history where we have a cheap, viable, fast alternative to energy crises brought about by geopolitical tensions. And it's so quick and easy as compared to 7 to 8 years it takes for one LNG terminal to be operational. So this is a huge, actually, narrative shift for us. And this is actually the biggest narrative point that the gas industry is scared of, and why they are still front and center, as both Rebecca's have mentioned. They're still front and center with the same narrative that they have been pushing for decades and decades, because now we're actually seeing the quick results that renewable energy can provide when it comes to not just energy affordability, but also putting up energy as quick and as easy as possible. I will stop here just to, to be mindful of the time. But a lot of this has really been driven by the United States appetite, very insatiable appetite for global energy dominance. The United States is still the world's largest LNG exporter, and the export capacity of the US is going to double by 2030. And that's a third of the global market in 5 years. So it is a strategy of energy dominance, but it is a strategy of geopolitical bullying. And that has set off a reactionary trend for diversification for many countries who used to see the United States as a reliable ally to provide, the same way that the Biden administration responded to Europe's call at the initial onset of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So, you have seen some political moves, especially from the European Union, where there is an EU methane regulation that's being discussed and negotiated, like implementation wise. And a lot of countries are now trying to disentangle from relying on US LNG and looking at other allies such as Canada. But the contrast to this is China's electrotech revolution. And China has been largely insulated from sort of like the leveraging that the United States has been doing on its quest for energy dominance. And they have really, their major energy export has always been renewable energy, and that continues to steadily climb, because especially in countries like in Southeast Asia, where they are thirsty for renewable energy, China has provided for them. So in contrast, where the US is really struggling and really employing geopolitical bullying tactics to get them to buy US gas, you have China, which has just easily been able to export renewable energy to neighboring countries and other countries around the world. So again, electrification, renewable energy, always going to be the counterattack to this kind of energy dominance. And I don't have the stat here, but I think it was sometime last year where someone compared how much the US has profited off of its energy exports, which is oil and gas, as compared to China's energy exports, which is primarily renewable energy. And China out-earned the United States by billions and billions of dollars. So it is, if you're looking at profits as a country, renewable energy remains to be incredibly profitable. So I'll stop there. And I don't think that completely answered your question, Faiza, but all I had to say is that we are in the middle, I think, of the question of like, why are countries not moving as quickly? I think it's just been really hard to see what the other side looks like. But now countries are looking at the other side, like have a really good vision of what the other side looks like and what going back to gas or staying with gas could be for them. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Brilliant. Thanks, Mima, for giving your insights and your analysis on the very current scenario of gas and LNG, and that's really super helpful. So very quickly, come going towards Devon. So Devon, we are heading into Gastech 2026, one of the major global gatherings of the gas industry. What do you think? What trends are you seeing in the LNG and gas sector right now? And are we seeing genuine structural changes in the industry, in this industry, or are we seeing a new generation of narratives being developed to keep gas investment alive? So over to you, Devon, and I will really appreciate if you can, keep your interventions a little bit brief, like within 5 to 6 minutes, so that we can take one or two interventions from the participants as well. So over to you, Devon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiza. Good evening, everyone. I think you can think of my presentation as pulling together a little bit of what everyone before me has shared. My name is Tawon, and I'm from Solutions for Our Climate, a climate nonprofit organization based in South Korea. So, yes, we work to accelerate global greenhouse gas emissions reduction and energy transition. So we work across several areas, but for today, I'll focus on our gas and public finance work. So this webinar comes just before Gastech 2026, the industry's largest showcase. So this year it runs in Bangkok from the 14th to the 17th of September. So the framing is the industry's own. So Gastech calls Bangkok the world's fastest growing energy demand region under the theme of where global energy supply meets demand. And at last year's Gastech, an advisor to Thailand's energy minister said LNG is the best transition fuel. So that transition fuel framing aimed at Asian demand will be front and center. And public finance is also right at the center of it. Japan runs a dedicated Japan Energy Strategic Program at Gastech on how its evolving energy strategy shapes LNG demand, power systems, energy security, and the wider regional market. Its public export credit agency, JBIC, is one of these speakers. Also, many Korean entities are taking part as well. So the institutions that bankroll gas are not in the background here, but they're on the stage. So, but here's the reality behind the framing. So let me use the industry's own favorite source, the IEA. On the IEA's numbers, supply is flooding in. If you look at the blue graph here, about 300 a year of new LNG export capacity expected in 2030, and even after you subtract the older capacity retiring over that period, there's still a net increase of roughly 250. But the demand does not keep up. If you look at the orange graph, even on their own numbers, there's a surplus of about 65 BCM by 2030, with the tightest oversupply expected around 2027 and 2028. So it's so much for the story that gas demand is exploding. And that surplus gets sold cheap to Southeast Asia. And this is the key point. Cheap gas will be the bait. And the low price is temporary, but the lock-in is permanent. A 20-year contract plus terminals, plants, pipelines outlast any cheap gas window. And when price spikes again, as they did in 2022 and again in 2026, it's a locked-in importer who pays. And the stranded asset risk sits with those importers. And also in a live example, Thailand, our host of Gastech, it would be the live example. It already has 2 LNG import terminals that are underused, and yet a third is being built, due in 2029. Under government's own gas plan, those two existing terminals are enough to cover demand all the way to 2037. The third one is capacity that nobody needs. And it's not just import terminals. In 2025, 7 of Thailand's private gas power plants ran below 10% capacity. And since 2023, keeping those underused plants available has cost Electricity Generating Authority of Thailand, EGAT, and Thai ratepayers over $5 billion for electricity that were barely generated. So who ends up paying? Thai ratepayers, and it shows up on their electricity bills. And that cost isn't in some distant future, but it's already underbilled today. So if the market does not justify all of this expansion, what keeps it going? A big part of the answer is public finance. The mechanism is simple. I think Elise have shared this insight before. So gas projects across the value chain are expensive and really risky. And this is the kind of risk that private banks won't carry alone. So public institutions step in and absorb it. They lend, they guarantee, and they insure. And that does two things at once. It makes bankable the projects that market would walk away from and pulls in private money that would otherwise stay on the sidelines. So public finance doesn't simply finance gas, but it will enable it. And this is where our own work comes in, Korea's public finance. So Korea has three main public financiers: the Import-Export Bank of Korea, which we call KEXIM, the Korea Trade Insurance Corporation, KSHO, and Korea Development Bank, KDB. And these are export credit agencies. They are public institutions that provide loans, guarantees, and insurance to Korean companies operating overseas. And the scale, as you can see here, is striking. Between 2020 and 2024, these three agencies committed about 49 billion US dollars to overseas energy. And if you look at the red graph, nearly 3/4 of that went to fossil fuels, and gas alone accounted for 58%. That is roughly a $7 billion a year, and it is one of the largest such flows in the world. And this is not a new stuff. And Korean public institutions poured $127 billion into overseas oil and gas over the last decade, which is 13 times their coal finance. So different reports, but the same finding. The Korea is one of the biggest enabler of overseas gas. And let me give you two examples that show that structure. The first one is upstream in the LNG value chain, the Mozambique gas project. So we have targeted these projects since 2024 because they are among the projects with the largest Korean involvement and because they show the pattern clearly. KOGAS, Korea Gas Corporation, is the shareholder, and Korean ECAs comes in as a syndicated lender, and a Korean company takes the EPC construction contract. So shareholding, lender, builder. So the whole set would be Korean. And the second example applies the same structure downstream in a power sector in the demand countries themselves. Take the Hai Long gas plant in Vietnam or the Chana project in Thailand. Korean involvement in these demand regions is large as well, and it follows the same shareholder, lender, builder logic. And this is why we go after finance. Public finance is the hinge. It is what makes these projects bankable when the market case is weak, and it is what pulls private money in behind them. So take the public money away, and many of these projects simply do not clear. This is why challenging the clean gas story also means challenging the money behind it. And let me end on the risk that ties all of this together: fossil lock-in and why Gastech itself matters. So Gastech is not simply a conference for dialogue and exchange. The previous edition in Milan in 2025 became a catalyst for several long-term LNG investment agreements that included a deal between the European Union and ExxonMobil and major LNG investment plans in Argentina, which is why Gastech 2026 in Bangkok will matter. It could serve as a platform for advancing long-term LNG deals, and in doing so, shape and lock in countries' energy policy and infrastructure for decades to come. And the timing sharpens it. Disruption around the Strait of Hormuz is raising the pressure to lock in new deals. And Qatar, major supplier to Asia, ships through exactly that choke point. So it's worth watching closely what comes out of Bangkok. Let me close with this. Fossil gas expansion is not inevitable. It's a choice, and public finance is central to that choice. So the real question is what this public money is for. It could just easily serve the transition that it's meant to serve. Challenging the clean gas myth means challenging the money behind it. And that is work we can do together, starting with what we watch for at Gastech. Thank you, and this is end of my presentation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Duang. It's really super helpful to understand the whole thing, mean what's coming and expecting from the Gastech 2026. So on the one hand, so many things on the gas. It's also coming, but definitely, as Mima said, that this is what the first time in the history that we have the cheaper and wonderful renewable energy alternate as a great option. So things are here and very clear in front of us. So thank you very much to all our four wonderful speakers. We now want to hear from you, the people joining us from different regions and organizations. We have a few more minutes. And as the questions come in, I really want to encourage participants to think not only about the evidence, but also about how we translate this evidence into action. So anyone, you can just raise your hand, just come in. Allison, Allison, come in and just, give your intervention. Open your mic. Yeah, please.
Hi there. Hi there. It's lovely to see so many of you. No, this has been really fascinating. And as I just put in the box there, that those last comments that this is not inevitable, it's actually a choice that's been made. And there are, and I think the other clearer message is how explicit the alternatives are, how ready they are. So I think we are in a good, being positive, we are in a good place to really question and push back on this. I had a few thoughts going along that I feel maybe worth prodding on is that when we had the methane action plan coming out of one of the COP and a half ago, then a lot of the money was being circled by the gas companies themselves, saying they could produce clean gas. If we clean up our methane, you will get cleaner gas. So basically trying to suck money into the gas sector to clean up its act rather than going to get rid of gas. So I wonder how, what sort of competence we have in that space. I mean, within the UK, the arguments for bringing in North Sea or expanding North Sea oil and gas is all about UK gas being cleaner than any gas that's going to be imported. It's becoming a big argument, but it's actually potentially taking climate finance away from the renewable alternative. And then just to mention, we haven't talked a lot about Mozambique's been mentioned a lot, but talking to the African Development Bank, there's a lot of highly paid for propaganda going into Africa for expansion that we need to counter. Around, Africa didn't cause this. Other countries have got wealthy on gas. Why shouldn't we? African women need it for cleaning. I mean, they're all false. That's a false stack of arguments that we need to knock backwards. But it is just being aware that they're failing a lot, the arguments in Europe. So they've moved to Africa to expand there and open new markets. So I think it's another, this is just building and sort of prodding from what I've heard today, but I think that Africa potential opening of market might take up some of that glut, and if prices go down, that's seen as an incentive rather than a move away. So I think there's just some of these things we maybe need to keep an eye on going forwards. But this has been fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as the time is also up, so I have just posted one quick one-liner question to all our speakers that what they really mean, give the message to the civil society organizations in this whole context if they are going to these spaces like World Bank annuals or Gastech 2026, that mean what one-liner message from them to all our civil society organizations. And with this, so thank you so much to all our four wonderful speakers for this important discussion. I think today's conversation leaves us with a very clear conclusion. The question is no longer simply whether gas should be described as clean. The evidence is increasingly clear that fossil gas is not a clean fuel and it is not a climate safe transition fuel. And as we move toward the Global LNG Convening, Gastech 2026, and the World Bank annual meetings, this conversation does not end here. It is where the next phase of the fight begins. So, thank you again to our speakers, to everyone who joined us, and to the Global Gas Working Group for organizing this conversation. Gas is neither clean nor a transition fuel. Thank you and see you at the next Gas Talk. Take good care of yourself. Goodbye.